Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello and welcome. Thanks, Graham, for the opening act. Thanks, Jay, for his absurdist introduction, which I've always enjoyed. I belong to the generation that still watch Monty Python. Maybe some of you did too. Right, I'll start with a little story. Last Saturday, I went to a party in Amsterdam, a birthday party of a friend of mine. I went with my girlfriend. And in the evening, when the party was over, we walked back to the tube station, the subway station, De Pijp, in order to take the Noord-Zuid line to Amsterdam-Zuid and then take the train home, since we don't live in Amsterdam. But on the way to the tube station, we actually passed a place called a Par Hasard. It's a pub or a cafe, also serving as a friet tent, as a French fries specialist that they advertised. And although we weren't hungry, we went in. The place was so nice, and it was even called Par Hasard, haphazardly, by chance. So we went in and actually spent an hour there, had the best French fries in Amsterdam that I know, and went on to go home. Well, that's a funny story, isn't it? But it's only the beginning. So we actually came from Schiermonnikoog on that day, where we had spent a week of holiday. And there's a special reason we go to Schiermonnikoog as often as we can, because we actually met on the ferry from Schiermonnikoog a while ago. And now you imagine these ferries, they run about 5 times a day. There are about 1,000 people on each run. But we happened to sit opposite each other. But it was in Corona time, so we were both divorced and have an earlier life. But it was in Corona time. And so we wore face masks and we could only see each other's eyes. And even they were protected by some sort of a plastic screen between us. Nonetheless, our eyes met, and the reason we felt attracted to each other is that we were the only people on the entire boat that were reading a book. So everyone else was watching their telephones or talking. In any case, so we're here now, and what's the point? The point is that both stories are examples of the oldest notion of randomness that at least we have in European literature or philosophy. And that's the phenomenon described by Aristotle, the famous philosopher of the 4th century BC, pupil of Plato. And according to Aristotle, randomness happens. He would use the word accident, at least in the Latin translations. Something is random or an accident if it's related to a lack of purpose. And more specifically, according to Aristotle, an event is random if it is an unintended consequence of pursuing some goal. And he gives various examples. His best example, I think, is a man, in these days there were men, who starts digging a hole in his garden in order to plant a tree. But lo and behold, he finds a treasure instead of planting his tree. And so the opposition that he creates is that if you dig a hole to plant a tree and find a treasure, is really different from having heard that perhaps there's a treasure in your garden and you start digging holes to search for it. So the second one, then it would be intended and not random to actually find a treasure. But if you're actually wanting to plant a tree, then it's random to actually discover a treasure. And so my 2 little stories are very similar. So in the first one, we went home after this party and we intended to reach the metro, the tube station. But instead, we ended up in this Par Hasard. Does anyone know it, in fact? It's on the Centuurbaan, I think. Well, it's highly recommended. And this as opposed to we being hungry. In fact, we weren't hungry at all. But you could imagine that we came from a party where no food was served and it was horrible. And we went for French fries, which we both liked. And then we had been recommended this bar, Par Hasard, and we had the French fries. That's a totally different story. The meeting on the ferry is similar. So we didn't take the ferry to meet each other or indeed meet anyone. We just wanted to go home after a holiday. And we met, and our eyes met, and so on, and the rest is history. And here the opposition is to, for example, a boat trip organized by a dating agency for singles. If you then, in fact, meet someone you later, you know, then it's different. That's not random at all. And so this is the oldest notion of randomness, and there are many stories. Maybe how many people who actually have a partner? I mean, I have the highest respect for singles. But of those who have met their partner, who has met his or her partner in such a way, namely completely unexpected and unintended? Yeah, that's about a third of the people, I think. And who hasn't? Well, that's maybe 1% even. So most of the people are singles. Again, I highly appreciate that, or didn't vote. In any case, one of the lessons is, and this will be repeated all the time, it's not so much the event itself that is random, it's the event plus its context. So again, meeting someone on a boat you fall in love with may not be random. It depends on the circumstances in which this happens. And this will be true for all the examples. Now for something completely different. You all recognize the painter. Who is it? It's Jackson Pollock. It's not one of his most... It's impressive because this is not a famous painting. It's always been in private hands. I would like to have it. It was auctioned for $140 million. The only time it was actually sold. And I think it's absolutely great. And I would also regard this as sort of an image of randomness, or at least something that came into existence in a random way. Because you know the reputation of Jackson Pollock and these guys, Rothko, and they were very heavy drinkers. Maybe they threw paint at the wall, but that's not true at all. So there's a very nice film on, you can see it on YouTube. It's called Pollock Painting, a film by Hans Namuth, a historian of art. It's only 12 minutes. I really highly recommend it. You see him at work. So firstly, the canvas is on the floor. It's not the painting I showed that he works on, but it's similar. And then he actually says the opposite of what I thought when I first saw the painting. Namely, he says, it's not random at all. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident. And then the voiceover says, Pollock gave his utmost attention to the selection of tools and material, their textures, viscosity and fluidity. So Pollock's painting seems not random in the sense of Aristotle at all. Namely, this was randomness, meaning lack of purpose. And his purpose seemed to be very clear. Nonetheless, I would say that Pollock's painting is random in at least two ways. I'll later add even a third way in which it is random, but not in the sense of Aristotle. And that's the first encounter we will have, and this is the running theme of the whole show. There are many different meanings of randomness. We will try to get a picture of this landscape, but this is, if you want to take one message home, is randomness doesn't have a single meaning. There are many versions, interpretations. They're all somewhat related, but they're all different. So I would say it's random in at least two different ways, or three. The third will come. Firstly, it depicts, but not in the eyes of the painter, but in the eyes of the beholder, myself. It depicts the famous swerve. So this was a mechanism for randomness. I would say it's the second oldest notion of randomness in European civilization, proposed by the philosopher Epicurus, a little bit after Aristotle. So that's one sense, and that's what the blue quote is about. So this is not from Epicurus himself, but you probably know this. Lucretius was an admirer of him a few centuries later, writing in Latin. His famous book is called De Rerum Natura. And this was lost, or believed to be lost, and then rediscovered in 1417. There's a whole book about this rediscovery. And according to some people, this was even the beginning of the Renaissance. I don't think that's true. But what he says about the swerve is here. So actually he paraphrases Epicurus. When the atoms are traveling straight down through empty space by their own weight at quite indeterminate times and places, they swerve ever so little from their course, just so much that you can call it a change of direction. If it were not for the swerve, everything would fall downwards like raindrops through the abyss of space. No collision would take place and no impact of atom on atom would be created. Thus, nature would never have created anything. And if you continue, I recommend not only the French fries place par hasard, but also this book. It's about 100 pages. It's a pleasure. It's very beautifully written. And he makes clear later on that by creating he also means free will is a consequence of this swerve. So that's one point in which I would say the Pollock painting is random, namely it's a picture of this swerve, which is one of the oldest notions of randomness. And the fact that very probably Pollock did not intend this meaning, we can't be sure, but he's a very well documented artist and there's no evidence at all that he had this in mind. But that also makes the painting random in the sense we've just learned, the sense of Aristotle, namely it's unintentionally a picture of the swerve. I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe it was to pursue action painting, do whatever, make money. But in fact, he gave the most beautiful picture I know of the swerve. And now there is a painting that I do have. It was painted by a friend of mine, Alexander Lachai. We were both theoretical physics students a long time ago in the 1980s. And then I actually went on with physics and mathematics and so on, but Alexander became a painter. And this was his first painting. And so I bought it for 300 guilders. And I bought it for the same reason, basically. I also want to have this Pollock. It looked to me like a portrait of randomness, in the sense of the swerve or something similar. But he said, no, he was insulted. It was a picture of biodanza. It's people who are dancing in a certain style. So it is the same story as with the Pollock painting. It's random because it's actually a portrait of something random, a concept of randomness, the swerve. And it's doubly random because the artist didn't intend this meaning. So that is interesting, I think. Now, I can't get enough of the Pollock painting, also not of the Lachai painting. It's actually in our living room, not this one. So there's another thing we can say about this painting. You could talk about this for hours, but I'll keep it relatively brief. The other painting you'll also know, it's one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century. It was one of the beginning paintings of abstract art, the Black Square by Malevich. And strangely enough, it's not my field, but if you read books about the history of art, they're both classified as abstract. So Pollock is an abstract expressionist, and Malevich is abstract in sort of an absolute sense. But in a way, there's a huge difference, since the Malevich painting is not abstract at all. I mean, it's a picture of a black square. And looking at this, let's say as a mathematician or in a technical way, the real difference between these two paintings is that the Malevich painting is very easy to describe, very, very briefly. Namely, it's a black square. And of course, you can add maybe by a 3-letter code which tone of black it exactly is. You can add the size, but you can get a very accurate description in a few lines. Of course, this is different from the emotion you have when you watch it and so on. But I'm a mathematician, we have no emotions. Okay, so the Malevich is easy to describe very briefly and accurately, but the Pollock painting is not like that at all. It can only be described without great loss by showing it. And that will be another extremely important and I think also a very interesting notion of randomness, namely that the random object is its own shortest description. And if you then look at art in general, you see that this distinction is in a way orthogonal or independent of the distinction between abstract and figurative art. So there are paintings of clouds, for example, or landscapes that in a way are like the Pollock, that are actually very hard to describe very briefly. But there's also paintings of a windmill, and you can say quickly what it is. And also in abstract art, there's Pollock, and there's Malevich at the opposite end of the spectrum. Also Mondrian, you could easily, again, forgetting the emotion you have as a viewer, but you can easily describe all the later paintings by Mondrian, like the Malevich, namely very briefly. And we can make this even more technical. So this iGen, that's most of you. I can't see you very well because I watched into the dark, basically. But I looked around in the restaurant, and I looked around when I came here, and most of you are much younger than I am. So that is called iGen, the internet generation. And so you think in terms of digital images, and then you can make this distinction more technical. So if you actually make a digital image, like a digital photo of both paintings, you will see that the Malevich image can be compressed enormously without much loss, whereas the Pollock cannot be compressed without considerable loss to the quality of the image. So either way, you can say it mathematically, you can say it in words, in descriptions. But nonetheless, let's do a little mathematics. This is the only mathematical slide. And it's not very mathematical, come to think of it. It just has 3 numbers on it. And if you look at them, firstly, I would have to say that the dot, dot, dot. So if you do the philosophy of mathematics, you talk about the infinite. That would be another interesting topic for science and cocktails, but not today's topic. These numbers are supposed to go on forever in a certain way. And now if you look at them, I hope you can all see them, and otherwise just listen. They all look random in a certain way. Namely, if you take as the criterion or definition of randomness in a number, that all the decimals, like 0 and 1, occur 10% of the time, that all pairs of decimals, like 0, 0, 2, 3, 7, 9, that they all occur 1% of the time, and all triples 1 promille of the time, and so on. That's a sort of an... it is a first idea of randomness of numbers. It was proposed in the beginning of the 20th century. Then if you apply that criterion, you can show that they're all random. But it's not a very good criterion, since if you look more precisely, let's look at the red number. It's called the Champernowne number, since he was the first to make the point I'm now going to make. So if you look at it, it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He just writes down all the numbers. And his achievement was to prove that it has this statistical property that I mentioned. But it cannot really be random. If you just write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's nothing random in that act, in just writing down or saying all these numbers. But that's what the random number does. So this criterion is maybe not so good. And in a deeper way, this also applies to the black number. So the black number you won't recognize unless you actually know everything about pi. Actually, I'm a mathematics professor, and we have an evening, the variété-avond for our students. And so like here at Graham, they often play music, or they play the piano, they sing a song, and or do some play. But there's one guy who didn't really know what to do, and so he learned the first 1,000 digits of pi, and he printed out a piece of paper, which everyone got, and then he said the first 100,000 decimals of pi, and everyone could check that he did it correctly. So that was his act. And then you see, he would recognize that this is actually a sort of a later part of the decimal expansion of pi, of which you know 3.14159, etc. If you go on for a couple of hundred decimals, you will encounter this block. And again, despite the fact that it looks pretty random, and indeed much more random than even the red one, it's not random at all, because pi has a formula, which you can write down in 4 lines, and that will spit out all the decimals of pi you ever want. So it's not very random at all, although it looks random. The only real random number is the upper one, the blue one. That is produced by what is called a quantum random number generator. But even here, I'll return to this, even here we can only say it's probably random. In a certain technical sense I won't go into very much. But it has, of all these numbers, the best chance of being a truly random number. In which sense? So you're probably now going to get the point. We are trying to find definitions of randomness, characterizations, notions of randomness. And then we'll see that there are various candidates, and they're all sort of interesting. And so here the definition is that the shortest computable, so computable you have to add, I won't explain what this means, but you can think of being able to produce by an algorithm or by a computer program, by your telephone, whatever. So its shortest computable description is the number itself. And so then again, the difference is this Champernoun number, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I could say 1,000 of these decimals without training even, but that's not random at all, because the shortest computable description of the number is write down all the numbers, and you've done it. And also pi, as I said, has a formula. It's 4 lines. And it's only the blue number that probably is random in the sense that its shortest description is the number itself. And so that's similar to the Pollock painting. And that's a really deep, interesting notion of randomness, I think, that Aristotle didn't think of, for example. So we're making some progress. Now, there's one thing I would like to say, which is suicidal, but you have to know it. Namely, so I first repeated this modern mathematical definition of randomness, at least randomness of numbers. But again, for iGen, most of you, the internet generation, everything is a number because everything can be digitized by scans, photographs. We're all binary files. And then the definition eventually proposed by the Russian, dare I say it, the Russian mathematician Kolmogorov, one of the greatest mathematicians of the previous century. So he proposed that the number should be very long or infinite. I won't go into that very much, but the idea is that what I said, a number is random if and only if its shortest computable description is the number itself. And you could also say, make the same point by saying the number is incompressible without loss, at least. And this is again is widely applicable since everything is a number. And now the paradox, which is maddening and suicidal, and I can't fall off. So it would have been a joke to walk back and fall off the stage and just disappear at this point, but it seems to go on. But the point is that you can show that also Kolmogorov already knew this. Almost every very long or infinite number is in fact random according to this definition. So the overwhelming number of numbers is incompressible. They can't be summarized. There's no formula for them. And yet, no, not a single given number can be proved to be random. And in particular, you cannot give an example of a random number. You only have sort of probabilistic arguments that I won't go into. But that's the reason I added this blue number on the previous slide is probably random. So this is maddening. We have a fantastic definition of randomness. And as I suggested, it doesn't only apply to mathematics. It applies to almost any object you can digitize. And this is any object. This incompressibility definition is really good. But we can't give a single example of which we know that it's random. And this is terrible, and we go quickly to the next slide. There's another definition, another notion, another idea of randomness that is much older than this definition of Kolmogorov of the 1960s. And before explaining this, the general observation seems to be that all notions of randomness, all definitions or interpretations of what we mean by saying that something is random, that have been proposed from Aristotle to the present day, and I let the present day basically end with this compressibility notion, they all have one thing in common. So they will all be a little bit different. All these notions, I'll explain this in more detail what I mean by that, by being a little different. But all definitions or ideas of randomness will be a little different, except that they have one thing in common, and that's that all these notions are defined negative. So randomness, in whatever meaning you give it, if you do it well, the definition will be saying what the thing is not. So I learned, I tried to understand not only mathematics, but also the divine and the universe. Very pretentious. And then I found that there's something called negative theology. And so the point of negative theology, has anyone heard of this? Okay, so the point which seems valid to me is that also anything valid you can say about God is negative. It's properties that he, she, or they do not have. So God is not in space and time. God is not finite, etc. So that seems to make sense to me, whatever you believe. And so randomness is like that. It's defined negatively. There is some property, and that varies from case to case, that the random thing, the random object, does not have. And so what was dominant after Aristotle was lack of knowledge. And what is meant is human knowledge. And then what varied through the ages is what the lack of knowledge was of. So if you take 1,000 years of, well maybe more, 1,500 years of intellectual European history, you could say that there was a move from Aristotle to medieval thinking, scholastic thinking. So Aristotle's lack of purpose made way for lack of knowledge of a purpose. And then in the Middle Ages, purpose meant divine purpose. So the medieval notion of randomness was that something is random if it reflects lack of knowledge of divine purpose. And then in the scientific revolution in the 17th century, the emphasis changed. So divine purpose was either replaced by or reinterpreted as the laws of nature. And then the thing became a lack of knowledge. So the let's say early modern, as historians say, early modern, 17th century definition of randomness was that it reflects lack of human knowledge about the laws of nature and or the relevant causes of events through the action of the laws of nature. Causes become the next event, so to speak. You could also say this in terms of initial conditions as a physicist. In any case, the idea is the laws of nature plus, you can call it either causes or initial conditions, like the place and velocity of a planet, and then you can follow its trajectory. They determine everything that happens. And our randomness was supposed to reflect our lack of knowing any of these components. So this is still dominant. I would say many people still interpret randomness in that way. In the 19th century, lack of purpose sort of made a comeback without, I think, ever mentioning Aristotle, but I'll get into more detail if we have time. So Darwinian evolution is based on random mutations, and they're random in the sense of lacking purpose, namely they are not intended to improve the species. Although they may do that, but they may also harm the species. And in the 20th century came the most spectacular coup of all, where lack of knowledge of causes, as in the 17th century, was replaced by lack of causes altogether. And that's what Jay in his introduction sort of referred to by writing down quantum mechanics. Ah, thanks. Yeah, this is a cocktail, I believe. And it's random because they offer about 15 cocktails, and I don't know. It smells, there's ginger in it, I think. Okay. Now. So let's explain it, because this in a way is the highlight of our understanding of randomness. And it's not so difficult, in fact. So if you look at this picture carefully, You see me. I mean, I'd rather have taken my girlfriend or someone else sitting there, but it was easier to use myself. So what's happening here? I'm sitting in my office at the university, and I reflect light from the TL light or daylight. I reflect it from my body or suit towards a window. And the window, in turn, reflects, let's say, half of the light back to me. And the light reflected back by the window reaches the camera of this iPad, and that's what gives the photo. But the other half of the light is transmitted, and that's why someone who is outside can also see me, and he or she will actually see the same image of the photo, but from different light. So the person outside sees the light that was transmitted through the window, and I or you, looking at this picture, see the light that's reflected inward from the window. Now, according to quantum mechanics, light consists of indivisible particles called photons, light particles. Already Newton knew this in a way, so that this in a sense predates quantum mechanics, but our modern understanding, which comes from Einstein, is quantum mechanical, and that's especially the indivisible claim. And then the key point is that a single light particle or a single photon is either transmitted as a whole and reaches the person outside who sees me, or it's reflected as a whole and it reaches, for example, the lens of the camera or my eye, and we see this. And now, according to quantum mechanics, this is like a coin toss, but it's a quantum coin toss. Let's say that there are 50-50 probabilities of reflection and transmission, but which of the two possibilities applies is totally random, in the sense that there's no cause. And you can even prove this. So Jay very kindly mentioned an essay prize I won. That's because I was actually, through con man claiming to repair my roof, made me the lighter of tens of thousands of euros. And so I had to take part in this essay competition to recover that. And I also won it. So, yeah. And in fact, in the history of science, it's very nice that this is almost gone now. Often interesting articles, famous articles sometimes, won an essay. So Stephen Hawking, actually, also Roger Penrose, they both became famous in black hole research for winning the Adams Prize. And so this doesn't have this quality, but I needed the money, and that's why I participated. And this is now totally proved that quantum mechanics, so a quantum coin toss, is absolutely random, irrespective of the development of physics in the future. So whatever physics will bring, of course physics goes on, it develops new results, new theories. Whatever they are, this will never change. So a reflection of light, and also things you may have heard of more in this context, are radioactivity, so the time of decay of a radioactive nucleus or atom. Also the pattern, the post-collision pattern, which I show here, of particle collisions at CERN. So this is in Geneva, this underground accelerator. Then so particles hit each other with enormous speed and decay into thousands of decay products. And the exact pattern, it's always very beautiful, but it's also random. You cannot give a cause or a reason, or you cannot determine what the outcome will be, as opposed to having two cars colliding in the classical world, and if you were to know everything, you could compute where all the things go. So randomness in quantum mechanics is absolute, and I would say quantum mechanics is unique for that reason. It's the unique case where randomness is not one of these other things, but it's lack of causation, or more technically, lack of determinism. Now, we do have a little time, so randomness in biology and medicine. It's, again, so we're playing the same game all the time. I'm looking for the negative, for the counterpart, for what it's not, the antipode. So as you know, I guess, Darwinian evolution is based on random mutations. And so now that you've heard this talk so far, you will ask immediately what kind of randomness is meant here. At least I hope you do this. Otherwise, all is lost. So the reason is, so Dobzhansky was a famous evolutionary biologist, geneticist in the mid-20th century. He said it very well: mutations are random changes because they occur independently of whether they're beneficial or harmful. And then the contrast is with this earlier notion of evolution predating Darwin's, namely Lamarckian evolution, which after Darwin was derided for 100 years, but now seems to be making a comeback, so that it's still valid, at least in bacteria. Does anyone of you work in this area? Well, then maybe Jay and Sanne should invite a speaker on this topic. So this Lamarckian evolution was once laughed away, but it's coming back. But in any case, let's be Darwinians, let's be official. That's the counter. That's what it's not. So in Lamarckian evolution, mutations are intended to improve the species. And so Darwinian evolution is Aristotelian in lacking purpose. So if you say that purpose is improvement or harm, the mutations, they're independent of that goal. They're one of the other, but that's not the reason they come into existence. And towards cancer, since you also, if you watch the introduction, I was supposed to answer the question whether people get cancer by chance. Firstly, mutations are random in this very, very specific sense, which in a way is typical for evolutionary theory. But they're not random in the quantum mechanical sense. At least this is unknown, whether they are. They're probably not. They are typically caused, these mutations, as you know. So Chernobyl was in the news recently, and very tragically. Mutations may be caused by radiation or by toxic chemicals. But they may also come from copying errors. So if you have cell divisions, this happens in your body all the time, not just in babies that develop, it happens all the time. So that then the first step is that your genetic material, your DNA, copies itself. So you have one copy, you get two, but there are replication errors, 1 in a billion, I think. A billion in the sense, in the American sense, milliard, 1 10 to the minus 9. So that may happen. That are sort of spontaneous mutations, and then they could go either way. It's very unlikely that they improve the species, but they may. And I think the speculation is that early evolution, just at the very origin of life, had that feature, that all the evolution even came from replication errors. But typically they're harmful, and if there are enough harmful mutations, you may get cancer. That is the nature of cancer. It's a genetic disease. And in a way, that's the price of evolution. We couldn't have had the benefits of evolution without the downside. And then we get to another meaning of randomness as being negatively defined, namely, what does it mean to get cancer in relation to randomness? And so cancer from DNA replication, for example, colon cancer, darmkanker, is one of the main examples of this, the kind of cancer one can get for this reason, replication errors, is random in the sense of, again, I'm looking for the opposite, for the negative. It's not being caused by bad habits, like lung cancer. So reality is more complex, but very roughly speaking, you can get cancer from bad habits, although these may even be enforced on you and you can't help it, but all right. But you can also get it for no reason at all. And then it comes from this replication error in your cell divisions that take place all the time. So it all fits in, this is tragic, but it all fits into my story of randomness. And now, since we're nearing the end, we should do some philosophy. I'm always very surprised by the enormous interest in this Tractatus. So the Wittgenstein you've heard of, he wrote 2 famous books, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and there is a new Dutch translation. I read an interview about it very recently. The first translation was by W.F. Hermans, I think, in Dutch. But that's a book that is very strange that people are interested in. It is completely wrong. Also, Wittgenstein himself noted this. So, you know, when he finished Tractatus, he shouted to everyone, all the problems in philosophy have been solved, and he became a gardener and an architect. And then he slowly began to see that nothing was solved. And then his so-called late period, so this is the later Wittgenstein, is the real depth of his philosophy. And you can summarize it very quickly. So I was a postdoc in Cambridge, and there's something called the Moral Science Club. That's basically the weekly philosophy seminar. It's in Clare College, it's in the evening. And the brief or the assignment to the speaker is to be as brief as possible, and all the rest will be discussion. So you're seated in armchairs. It's not like this. There are not so many people. And then one of the speakers, when I went just as a visitor to this, I didn't attend it regularly, but just as a tourist, you could almost say. And then so the person actually giving the seminar said, according to the later Wittgenstein, meaning is use. Let's discuss this. And so that was the seminar, and the rest of the evening was spent discussing this summary of the later Wittgenstein. But this philosophical investigations is full of ideas, and one of the famously good ideas is the notion of a family resemblance, and that's what Wittgenstein actually applied to games and to languages, for example, but not to randomness. And that's a pity, because I think it fits in very, very well. And in order to get this idea, I first quote from an early version of the philosophical investigations called the Blue Book. So some of you may know, you have the Blue Book and the Brown Book, they're from the 30s. And then these investigations, which are famous, are from the 50s. So in the Blue Book, he already said something that, so I ask you to apply to the notion of randomness. The idea that in order to get clear about the meaning of a general term, one had to find the common element in all its applications, has shackled philosophical investigation. For it has not only led to no result, but also made the philosopher dismiss as irrelevant the concrete cases, which alone could have helped him to understand the uses of the general term. So this is more or less a problem that he puts, and then the solution comes in the philosophical investigations. I am saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common, in virtue of which we use the same word for all, but there are many kinds of affinity between them. We see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, similarities in the large and in the small. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, feature, color of eyes, gait. Gait is like trot, it's the way you walk. Temperament, and so on and so forth, overlap and crisscross in the same way. So that's the way I came to think about randomness with all these cases in mind. And if you think about it in that way, if you look for these overlaps and crisscross similarities, you can look at all these examples in a deeper way. For example, if I return to my examples, so meeting your future, my future, your future partner on a ferry is random. It's not random even in one way. So it's random in the sense of Aristotle, which we discussed. But it's also random in a different sense, namely it's a coincidence. And in fact, if you ask people what they mean by a random event, they will typically give examples of coincidences, and there is an official definition due to two statisticians, Diaconis and Mosteller. A coincidence is a surprising concurrence of events perceived as meaningfully related with no apparent causal connection. And this is not taken so seriously in science, and that's why I spent very little time on it. But you can think of examples like Stephen Hawking, who was born on the dying day of Galileo. In fact, he always stressed himself wherever he could. It was even exactly 300 years, his birth, after the death of Galileo. And although he may not have realized it, Hawking also died on Einstein's birthday. And almost all coincidences are cases like that. Now another point, even meeting your future partner on a boat trip for singles that is organized by a dating agency. So the point of my example is that that was not the case. We wanted to take the boat home, but we met. But it might have been. I never entered the dating, never subscribed, but this is imaginable. That you actually do that, and if it's a good one, organize a boat trip and you meet someone. Even that is random, though not in the sense of Aristotle. Since your goal in joining this trip, I would feel sorry for people who do that, I think, but is actually to meet the love of your life. And even that is random, but not in a different sense. It's random in the sense of unpredictable. When you join, you don't know the outcome, and sometimes there isn't even an outcome. And this unpredictability notion is another good notion of randomness. So unpredictable, again, it's negatively defined. It's not predictable. And so each digit in a random number. So we had a definition of random numbers that you may now recall. It was that they are their own best or shortest description. You cannot compress them. You cannot sort of simplify it. You, like the Pollock painting, you have to show the whole painting to summarize it. Now, if you apply this to the technical case of numbers, then you can show that, in fact, each next digit is unpredictable in a very precise way. And the same is true for tossing a classical coin, kop of munt, and it's also true for tossing a quantum coin. So these are families of examples that share one property. And tossing a quantum coin, that's like the Pollock painting. I could talk about this for the rest of the evening if we had time. Is random in at least 3 ways. So my original introduction of the quantum coin, again, think of reflection of light, that it was uncaused. So we called it random, well, I called it random, because it doesn't have a cause. So the single photon hits the glass, hits the window, and whether it's transmitted or reflected has no cause. One of the two things happens. By the way, if you think about it, you'll also be driven crazy. It cannot be that something doesn't have a cause. Nonetheless, it happens. So that was the original meaning of randomness in quantum coin tossing. But it's also unpredictable. And if you do a very large or even infinite number of quantum coin tosses, then the outcome sequence, so that will be binary. If it's heads or tails, 0, 1, you get 0, 1, 1, 0. You can show that that is incompressible. So it's random in the sense of Kolmogorov. In fact, that's what I proved in winning this amount for the essay and paying off my debts because of the con man for the roof. Also, Pollock's painting is random in 3 different ways, maybe even more. And this I've already covered. So its only lossless description is the painting itself, unlike the black square of Malevich. It depicts randomness. In this specific case, it depicts the swerve, this Epicurean example, and it unintentionally does so. I already mentioned these points, so this is a summary. So it's random in the sense of Aristotle. And this you will often see. So if you really look at an interesting random phenomenon, it will be random in various different ways, almost without exception. Okay, now the slide you came for. I need heavy intake now, so. Which is the relationship between randomness and the meaning of life. And I have a number of propositions, and I would like you to vote on them. And now let's do it by standing and not by hand waving. So, who thinks that life has no meaning because the universe is just a clockwork? Well, many people thought this a while ago, but and who thinks that the meaning of life unfolds as the divine clockwork unwinds? There's only one, there are 2 votes, and most people abstained. But you can see that these 2 claims are opposite. They're mutually exclusive. They're the opposite claim of the other. And from a logical point of view, they're both true. So everyone should have stood up for both claims. Because in logic, if the premise is wrong, so the universe is not a clockwork because of quantum mechanics. So if A implies B and A is wrong, then A implies B is always true. You learn this in logic. Okay. Let's do a more serious one. Life has no meaning because evolution has no purpose. Who's in favor of that? 4 or 5 people. And then the opposite. The meaning of life comes from our giving it some purpose. Yeah, that's, I would say, a balanced majority. Life has no meaning because the outcome of quantum coin tosses, which eventually determine everything, are arbitrary. Yeah, there's a very courageous vote in favor, but it's only 1, 2, 3, 3.5, 4. And then the opposite point of view, the meaning of life derives from our freedom to make arbitrary choices and live by their consequences, which is a summary of the philosophy of Sartre, I think. Yeah, this is fairly popular. And then finally, science has driven meaning out of the universe, as Max Weber said. Yeah, this is about 2.5 votes. And the answer would be by the psychiatrist Carl Jung. Meaning exists outside science. And then he has a mechanism for that, which are his synchronicities. Some people are familiar with that. They're sort of special coincidences. And they're given meaning by a concept of meaning, which he calls zin, which exists outside science. He says science excludes that, but it exists. So who believes that? Well, that's almost the largest turnout of yes votes. Okay. Yeah, so I'll hide my own preferences. And I'll give you a summary. So I think the main point is really the following. Randomness does not have a single meaning. It is a family resemblance in the sense of Wittgenstein. So it has various meanings which overlap. And each of these meanings is defined by negation, by what some property is not. And the properties negated in the senses of randomness we've discussed are purpose, that was the initial Aristotelian case, compressibility or admitting a shorter description. Again, the point is something is random because it does not, like the Pollock painting, admit a shorter description. What you can deny is knowledge of a divine plan or knowledge of the laws of nature and initial conditions or causes. In quantum mechanics, you actually, the property denied by randomness is causality itself or determinism. In coincidences, it's the causal connection between the two legs of the event that is denied. And predictability, if you have unpredictability, it's a sense of randomness. So this is the main point, and then the fun part is within the confines of science, and this is what I tried to show on the previous slide, which was not at all meant to be serious, is that from a scientific point of view, it's very hard to agree or even discuss the way that randomness impacts the meaning of life, because for every reasonable proposition about randomness and the meaning of life, you can say the opposite, and they can both be defended. And the more radical point of view is that science is a completely irrelevant context because meaning is something that lives outside science, which I don't believe. Nonetheless, there's one thing you should all think about, and that's how you relate to randomness. For example, I was one of these people who were over-insured. This is very typical for Dutch people compared to other countries. But after I met my girlfriend on this boat, which I still see as a tribute to the idea of randomness, I cancelled all my insurances and I just thought, let it come. Okay, thanks.
The one plus one is always made two. Money feels could be different if I was with you. If I was with you. The one plus one is always made two. Money feels could be different if I was with you. If I was with you.